I suddenly felt a tightening sensation around my head. It was as if there was a band of something round there which was tightening, and I felt that I was going to faint. I thought that it would be wiser to faint inside the restaurant than outside, and I sat down and waited. It lasted about a minute. It went off, and all was well. It was just as if nothing had happened, and I paid the bill and we left, and I completely forgot about that. At 5:15 in the afternoon, it was time to go home. When I arrived at Weedon Crossroads, I turned right onto the A5 and immediately saw a brilliant red light on the left-hand side above the road and a brilliant green light on the other side. My thoughts were that it was an aircraft which was going to zoom over my head and crash. But the other traffic went slowly. I went slowly at the same pace as them because it was a busy road. And I realised soon that these two lights were attached to a grey dumbbell-shaped object which was above the road. It's been estimated since that it was 50 feet wide and about 100 feet above the road. And I went along and, of course, had to drive underneath it. As I went along the road then towards Church Stowe, where I live, I could look back and I could see this was still there and the lights were flashing. The green light was still flashing and the red light was not. The next part of the road was covered with trees, and I remember driving under the trees. But when I came out from under the trees, well, I don't remember coming out from them, because suddenly the car was stationary, everywhere was black, real pitch black, and I didn't know where I was. I knew I was in the car because my hands were on the steering wheel. I couldn't see the road, the trees, the buildings. I could see absolutely nothing, not even the car I was sitting in. And, of course, I sat there and wondered where I was. I wasn't afraid in any way at all, just wondered where I was. And suddenly, a brilliant white circle of light about 1 metre across shone on the road to the side of the car, and it went off and everywhere was black again. And then another circle of white light, exactly the same as the one before, shone just towards the front of the car, and they went on and off in a circle round the front of the car. And then they went back in a semicircle round to where they started, on and off, and again in the same way to my side of the car, and this one shone in the garden of a cottage on the right-hand side. It was then as if it was turned and it went up the front of the cottage and off the top. I sat there thinking, these lights must have come from above because they were completely circular, but there were no beams, so but I couldn't see anything. I didn't know why they'd come, where they'd come from, or what. And as I sat thinking about this, suddenly I was about 30 yards further down the road, driving in third gear quite normally, as I had done or had been doing at the end of the trees. My journey had taken 30 minutes and it should have taken 15. Somewhere along the line, presumably while I sat in the car, I'd lost 15 minutes of time.
Elsie Oakensen's case is very important in the UFO field for a number of reasons. Firstly, when she had her experience, which she remembered very little consciously, but there was a gap, a time lapse as we call it, and that was subsequently explored under hypnosis, she came out with a crucial piece of information, which was that basically she'd been scanned and rejected by entities who were involved, presumably, in the experience. Now, that matches something which has occurred in a few other cases around the world and which we're beginning to be noticing as a trend, although when her case was investigated by us back in 1978, when it happened, this trend was totally unknown. In fact, several of the cases which are now part of the trend hadn't even happened. So it's totally independent testimony of a phenomenon which we now recognise as real and important. 4 women in a car at a village called Preston Capes, which is about 4 miles from Church Stowe, where Elsie lives, were driving to a meeting in Northampton when they also saw almost exactly the same thing that Elsie had seen about an hour and a half, 2 hours earlier. They described it as projecting beams of light down onto the car, and the car engine and its lights began to falter and fade. As is often the case in these experiences, there was a kind of blink in reality, and then the thing disappeared and the experience was over. I talked to the witnesses, or I tracked a couple of them down to see if they'd be prepared to explore this case further, because obviously there was a possibility that there was missing time here. They didn't remember whether there was, and that if we explored it under hypnosis, it was conceivable that we may have found deeper memories there. But they were absolutely against that. They did not want to explore this any further. They preferred to forget all about it, as many witnesses do, and just wish that it never happened to them. It was an incident in their lives that was something they did not want to think about.
I've called them ghost-like beings because I didn't know how to describe them in any other way. It was like a ghost with a head on the top and a kind of a body and tail. It seemed to come towards me and it seemed to go away, but it didn't change size, and then it was no longer there. And then a more rectangular shaped one came on the other side of the light. It was as if it was standing on one corner, and if you wanted to describe it as a person with a sheet over his head, I suppose you could say, well, there was the head and the other two corners could have been arms and this was the feet. But, and some people have described it as that. I don't think of it as that. I think of it as being another ghost-like shape. I found that my hands were becoming very warm in the palms of my hands and my fingers started tingling. And I didn't know what that was at all. It usually happened late at night, and I didn't. You know, there's no way about it. I had no idea what it was. We'd got a friend who was ill at the time, sadly dying from cancer, who we used to visit. And when I visited him, I always had contact with him. I always kissed him hello and goodbye, held his hand. And I found that after I'd left him, I felt quite ill for about an hour and a half. And I told someone about this one day, and she said, "Oh, you're developing as a healer." And I've just been accepted, and I'm now a registered healer with the National Federation of Spiritual Healers.